Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for today's conference call and webinar called Starting with Yes, Tips for Making Your Faith Institution More Inclusive of People with Disabilities. Now, as you may know, Respectability is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with a goal of fighting stigmas and advancing opportunities for people with disabilities. We work with a variety of different people, from those in the entertainment industry, policymakers, educators, employers, faith-based organizations, philanthropists, journalists, and others in order to achieve our goals. Today we have the honor of having Shelley Richman Cohen on for our webinar. She is a founder of Respectability, as well as the founder and director of the Jewish Inclusion Project, which develops and conducts disability inclusion training programs for rabbinic students and Jewish leaders. She also has served as a coach and advisor to synagogues on increasing inclusivity. Cohen speaks nationally as an active advocate for the inclusion of children with disabilities in Jewish communal, educational, and recreational environments. She serves on the boards of the Foundation for Jewish Camp and Respectability, as well as on the executive committee of the American Board of Beit Isi Shapiro, an innovator of therapies and programming for children with developmental and physical disabilities. She is a former board member of SAR High School in Riverdale, New York, and is a current board member of Lincoln Square Synagogue. So thank you very much, and can we all join Shelley Richman Cohen now, as she will lead our webinar.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I want to welcome all of you to this webinar, but before we begin, I would like to dedicate, actually, this webinar in memory of Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, who passed away this last night. For those who do not know of her, she was for decades one of the most eloquent, classy, brilliant, and effective champions for social justice in the American Jewish community. And after she herself suffered a traumatic brain injury as a result of a car accident, she became one of the religious community's most impactful champions for disabilities' rights. She also played a crucial role in starting the institution of the Jewish Disability Network for the Union of Reform Judaism. She was a wonderful, wonderful, lovely human being, and she will be sorely missed by all those people who work to further the rights of people with disabilities. And now I'd like to begin. I also want to say thank you to Lauren, and especially to the head of Respectability, Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi, who has started Respectability and has really single-handedly done more, I think, for moving the needle forward for the rights of people with disabilities to be included in our society at large. And just a big hats off to Jennifer, and let's begin talking about inclusion in our religious institutions. I'm going to speak specifically about synagogues, but really this is an ecumenical webinar that I think many of the best practices and the tips involved in trying to create more inclusive religious institutions can be used for churches and mosques, and even though I'm speaking specifically about synagogue inclusion, I do think that this really has a much broader appeal. The first and foremost, we have to realize what we're dealing with here. And we all know that in a country where we have 323 million people, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, 56.7 million have some form of physical, developmental, or learning disability. This same statistic essentially says that 18.6% of the population has some form of disability, and this certainly goes for the Jewish community. When one looks at this number, you have to think about it. 1 in 5 people have some form of disability. And if one thinks of one's own synagogue or place of worship, you have to think about it. Do you really see that if you count it off by 5, do you have that population within your community? Most people, if they answered honestly, would chances are say no. And you have to ask yourself, why not? And you have to ask yourself, what can we be doing better to make this happen? The inclusion of people with disabilities has to be viewed not as an act of kindness, but really as a religious obligation. In Judaism, we say it is a chiyuv, not a chesed. There is a saying that the world stands on 3 things, Torah, Avoda, and Gimlut Chasadim. Torah, the Bible, Avoda, worship of God, and Gimlut Chasadim, acts of kindness. In Judaism, people often put the inclusion of people with disabilities under the rubric of an act of kindness. And I say that it's really not. This is really an obligatory act from the Torah, V'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, to love one's neighbor as one loves oneself. And we have to view creating an inclusive community within our religious institutions as just that, as an obligation for us all to create the right Jewish communal setting that we want to have in our synagogue. In order to have real inclusion, it is a proactive process. It is not something that one can just say, oh, of course we're inclusive of people with disabilities. The sentiment may very well be there, but unless certain things are put into place, there's not really a way that you can be inclusive. If you have a lot of stairs leading to get into your house of worship, if there isn't a ramp there, a person who is a wheelchair user will not be able to get inside the synagogue or church or mosque. The certain things have to be put into place. If you have a visual impairment and you want to pray and you need large print, if the prayer book is not in large print, it's very hard for a person to say, oh, I'm going to come to this and pray in this synagogue, and they won't be able to. If they can't use a siddur, how are they going to, the prayer book, how are they really going to pray? So it has to be a proactive process where you get the staff and the people, both lay people and administrative staff of your house of worship, to start thinking about what to do. Oftentimes, when people start thinking about inclusion, they think, well, our building it was built in the 1950s. It's mid-century modern. There's so many stairs. There's so many. It's so inaccessible. It would cost us so much money to become inclusive that, it's just not something that we can really do realistically. And I always say to people who have said these sorts of things to me that don't make perfect the enemy of good. And by that I mean you can't always use money as an excuse. You have to say to yourself, okay, let's think, how can we create programming that can maybe be accessible to those who might not have a mobility impairment? How are we going to change our programming? What are we going to do within the context of the synagogue that will create still an inclusive sort of environment? And is it possible to buy temporary ramps versus making this multi-dollar investment of architecturally changing the house of worship? And instead, is there a way to ramp into into a different room and maybe hold the service in that room, or maybe hold the programming that you want to do in a room that has a potential for being more accessible. When there is a will to try and create an inclusive environment, it is often, you have to think out of the box, and you can't always make dollars an excuse as to why you are not trying and working harder towards being accessible. To really have an inclusive environment, one needs to have essentially three things working within your institution. There has to be a level of empathy, there has to be a thought of a course to create action, and there has to be an accountability for how you are going to fulfill that action. The empathy really means that you have to start thinking back on that 18.6%, that fifth of the community that has some form of disability. And you have to, instead of saying, you know, listen, we can't have our Sabbath morning groups, you know, catering to these couple of kids who have all these sensory issues, and then, you know, we have to think of the greater whole, and we have to do what is normative for the greater whole. You have to have a sense of empathy and say, you know, how do these parents of these children who have disabilities, how are they feeling? How are they able to feel like they can be included in this religious community or not? You have to have a sense of really what are these other people going through, a sense of the other, of how you want to create a faith-based community that has values that are empathetic, that really go the extra distance. And then when you think about the action, I think you have to think in terms of what are we going to do and how are we going to approach these people and think about what they are going to do, what they would like to have happen. And then the concept of the accountability comes into play, where you say, what type of infrastructure are we going to put into our synagogue to really enable inclusion to take place, and to have a proactive process that is set up within our synagogue, within our house of worship, that will really be able to address the needs of those who come that have disabilities. The barriers to inclusion are often architectural, attitudinal, and communicative. Architectural is the fact that oftentimes there are steps, oftentimes there are not wheelchair accessible bathrooms, and that is very crucial. People need to be able to go to the bathroom, and if they cannot go to the bathroom, I think that there needs to be some sort of letting people know that you want them to come, but yet this is an obstacle. And maybe that is the first thing that has to be on the to-do list within creating a synagogue, is to really allow that aspect of taking care of the physical needs. Attitudinal, that's often a barrier. People, although we live in an age and a time right now that the word inclusion is probably the go-to word of the times, inclusion, oftentimes when it comes to people with disabilities, there is sometimes a feeling of, I don't like these people around. Sometimes it's a feeling that there is a bit of prejudice, I believe, that goes towards people with disabilities. They don't look quite the same. They might not sound quite the same. There's a sense of difference, and that can often be a barrier. But I think with education and with an attitudinal desire to change, this is something that can be changed within the synagogue. It starts usually at the top with the rabbi, and the executive director having to be on board of saying this matters to them, that this is something that they want to break down these attitudinal barriers, and it has to be spoken from the pulpit. But these attitudinal changes can happen, and they happen through, as the third thing that's listed on the slide, communication. Through communication, these barriers can be taken down. But communication needs to be had. Oftentimes, communication is the most neglected aspect of working in a synagogue. They will be doing something that is very inclusive, and they don't advertise it, they don't single it out, they don't say people with disabilities are welcome. Oftentimes, you'll hear somebody in the office of a synagogue saying, well, we don't want to single them out. But the reality is that unless it's really spelled out in weekly newsletters, unless it's spelled out on websites, unless it's spelled out by all sorts of communications and flyers about programming, people with disabilities don't necessarily know that they really are able, that they are going to be accommodated within your synagogue. So communication is a very, very key component towards making and creating a more inclusive house of worship. One always needs to ask questions of those people within the community who you do know of. When I said to think about that 18.6%, that fifth of your community, that are they present in one synagogue and has a disability? Maybe you went and you thought to yourself, well, I can think of 3 people. Well, those 3 people that you thought of, have they been spoken to? Are their needs being addressed? And I think that on a base level really needs to happen within every synagogue, church, or mosque, that those people who have disabilities that are known or have children with disabilities that are known, that they are asked, how are things working for you? You know, is there more that we could do to make your child feel more comfortable, to make you feel more comfortable? And if so, how can we make this happen? And what are and when you will be amazed to see how the reactions of people, so often it's simple little things that, you know, a person who uses a walker who has trouble, she just wishes she could always get an aisle seat. It's something that then a synagogue can put up signs on a number of aisle seats and say, just please give this seat to a person who might have a mobility issue. The same sorts of signs that you see in a subway or on a bus to give up the seat can be put on the back of an aisle seat, and you have made that person who every week might feel very awkward in coming in and having to put away the walker and then have to navigate going into the pew within your synagogue, and it's difficult. All of these things make such a difference to see, and they're such a quick, easy fix if you just think about it. There are always next steps, and asking and finding out is the easiest way to really address these needs. The next aspect of really being an inclusive house of worship is to be really a good listener, to validate, to be compassionate. That it seems like I'm saying something that's so common sense and so easy, but you would be amazed at how often this is so missed by so many. There's always a solution. I'm a big believer in that, and if you approach things in a way that we're going to solve whatever problem comes before us, you're going to come up with an answer. It might not be the best answer, but it will be some sort of answer. And stopgap answers, as long as you're working with the person with a disability or the family member who has a person with a disability in the family, as long as you're working together to try and find a solution, I think it helps in a very long way for that person or that family that has a person with a disability to feel included and to feel validated and to feel like the house of worship is really listening to them and really, what's more, wants them to be there and to be part of their community. It's also important to make sure that you have infrastructure through your programming, that if you're going to have like this, many synagogues, this week is the holiday of Purim, on Sunday or this coming Sunday, many synagogues have Purim carnivals for children. To make that carnival open a half hour or an hour early for those families who have children on the spectrum or children who have sensory issues that cannot take those large crowds. All it takes is a little bit of thought, of proactive thought of saying, you know what, we're going to open this early, we're going to advertise it, and then maybe what's even better, go the distance and take one classroom that's in the synagogue and create a calming sensory room where if one, so that maybe one parent who has the child who has autism will be able to go into the sensory room after the child has been able to be in that pre-opening time slot of the carnival. Then the one parent can go into that sensory room, and the other children who are not on the spectrum can then continue in the carnival when it's all noisy and crazy and be with the other parent. Just think, as a family then is able to have an afternoon activity together in a synagogue or any religious institutional setting that feels, oh, we're a part of this, that we as a family are functioning together as part of the general community. I always say that whenever I get phone calls all the time from different parents, people with disabilities, all about varying things of being like excluded from various infrastructures within the Jewish community. And I always listen, and I always try and be creative. And if I don't know enough, I say, you know what, there's enough information out there. We live in a day and age where there's so much information at our fingertips. We can always learn more, and we can always think to figure out, okay, maybe there's another better way that we can be doing this. Use the internet. Think about it. If you come and there's a family you hear and you're approached and the family is very specific about the child's disability, you can look up and read about what the disability entails, what are various characteristics of the disability, and maybe that can help you further your creative juices to say, we should be doing this, we could do that, we could fine-tune what it is and create a programming infrastructure that will work towards making things far more effective for people with disabilities. Architectural barriers. One has to approach architectural barriers in a very long-term and short-term sort of way. Oftentimes, you have an older building that is not wheelchair accessible. According to the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, all religious institutions were grandfathered in for whatever architectural structures they had. They, unlike all public buildings that you go to where you always see ramps and wheelchair accessible elevators, those religious institutions were grandfathered in that they could remain in their inaccessible state and without any consequences. And unfortunately, especially in the Jewish community, that began to be a way that, whenever building synagogues, oftentimes the powers that be decided, we're exempt, we don't need to worry about this. We don't have, we don't have people with disabilities, so why worry about it? At the time, of course, there were people with disabilities, but they couldn't get in, so of course people think, they don't have people with disabilities. I know of a case of a synagogue in particular where a new rabbi came to the synagogue, and his first thought, it was a very mid-century modern building that was very inaccessible, and he ended up getting a very large donor who came to him with a six-figure sum and said, Rabbi, I think you are so terrific. I want to give you this gift. And he said, and if I give you this gift, what will you do with it? And the rabbi said to him, I'm going to make this synagogue wheelchair accessible. And I'm going to put this money all towards making it wheelchair accessible. And the guy looked at the rabbi and he said to him, but why would you do that? Just think, with this kind of money, all the programming you could be doing. And the rabbi answered back to him, what you're not understanding is, if I'm not accessible to one Jew, ultimately I'm accessible to no Jews. And he said that with that, he did put the money towards making the synagogue accessible. And ironically, the very first Shabbat that the ramping system that was put into place to make it more accessible, and they moved they did a short-term goal. He put the majority of the money into the long-term goal of making the entire building accessible, but he did some short-term things to make it more accessible, and he moved the where the prayer services into a room on a different level that was lower, that was able to be accessed through ramping a certain set of stairs. And when he did that, it turned out that he learned that 4 people with different disabilities showed up on that first Friday night service, and it turned out that they were 4 individuals who lived in a group home that was less than 4 blocks away from their synagogue. And nobody had ever known about it, and it was a group home that was from the Foundation for Jewish Group Homes, and nobody had even known it was there, because those people couldn't go to synagogue beforehand. And now that this rabbi had made it more accessible, he had new members attending that synagogue. So I think that architectural barriers, you have to have a short-term and a long-term fundraising goals in order to address the fact that those things need to change. Purchasing of you can purchase or build temporary ramps. You can repurpose room usage. Signage is very important so that people know what you have and what you don't have in the way of making your synagogue accessible. And by that I mean, if you have large print sidurim, if you have a braille sidur, all of these things need to be marked, and there has to be signage up so that people understand. Where you have a wheelchair accessible bathroom needs to be marked so that people know this is where there is wheelchair accessible bathroom. You might have only one in the building. That one has to be marked so that people know. It's all part of the educational process for people in general to see that there are people with disabilities out there, and the synagogue is working towards creating a more inclusive environment. And again, it all gets back down to communication, that by seeing signage, by understanding what's happening, by advertising that we're going to try and create a capital campaign that's going to work long-term on making the synagogue accessible. And by making it accessible, it means more than just ramping to enter into the synagogues, but the major places of worship within a synagogue, the amud, the bima, where most times synagogues will, even if they're accessible, all of a sudden reaching to the bima or to the amud, where the amud is the central spot where oftentimes the Chazan will lead the prayer service. Those areas often have steps to them, and there has to be a thought and an involvement to say, why shouldn't a person be able to be, with a physical disability, be called to the Torah? And therefore, those areas of the synagogue also need to be thought about and proactively, and to be thought up to make sure that those are also accessible. When we talk about the attitudinal and awareness barriers, in order to really break that down, there has to be an amount of education. You have to educate the staff, you have to educate sometimes the rabbi, you have to educate the board of directors, you have to educate the congregation by first and foremost being inclusive of people with disabilities written into your mission statement that is on the website of your synagogue. That's the very, very first portal into entree into the synagogue world. Oftentimes, if a person with a disability is moving into a new community, they'll put in synagogue disability, and you'll see what pops up. The synagogue that has being inclusive of people with disabilities in their mission statement, that synagogue is going to come up, and a person is going to be able to say, let me take a look at this synagogue and see whether this is a place I really want to bring myself and my family to have a religious home. I think it's very, very important that it be periodically in a rabbi's sermon. That is when the head of your religious home talks about being an open, welcoming, inclusive environment, that is the first stop by saying there's a trickle-down theory, I always say, in religious life, and it comes from the rabbi. In the Reform movement, I know it also comes from the rabbi and from the Chazan, that the cantor, that these are the people who really set the tone. And if they talk about it, if they include it in their words from the pulpit, it goes a very long way in really creating this feeling of inclusivity. I think it also very much needs to be posted in weekly newsletters that the House of Worship is a place that's welcoming of people with disabilities, and in that there also has to be a name if you need special attention for if you're a person with special needs and need special accommodations, please see so-and-so, that there's a number or an email address of who to contact in the synagogue, that an infrastructure is set into place so that somebody in the synagogue office knows, this is what I need to do if a person with a disability calls and they are talking about a specific need that they need, this has to be spelled out, and it should be seen by everybody in the weekly newsletter so that they know what's happening and that they know that this is an important part of the community, to have people with disabilities as part of our community. And in social media, when social media is being used, it should be posted that events and various services or programming is open to people with disabilities. There are practices and policies that are a mainstay of being proactively inclusive of people with disabilities. There's a disability etiquette of how we want to speak and how people with disabilities should be addressed. It's not the Down syndrome kid. It's the child with Down syndrome. There is a way of speaking of language. The verbiage now is people with disabilities. That's the preferred verbiage, and it's important to start thinking that way, that we don't use the disability as an adjective. It is just a part of what a person is. It's a person with a disability as opposed to a disabled person. It's very important for synagogues and for other houses of worship to create inclusion committees, because there has to be somebody who is thinking proactively about how we are seeing to it that whatever's happening in our synagogue or in our house of worship is really working and thinking to be inclusive of people with disabilities. Oftentimes, it's a wonderful thing if you can have an inclusion coordinator. Some synagogues I've worked with have hired inclusion coordinators. Other synagogues have a designated lay leader as an inclusion coordinator. But it's important that there is somebody who is seen as, or a committee of people that are seen as the people who are seeing to it that they're keeping this segment of the community involved and included in whatever is going on in the synagogue setting. Oftentimes, synagogues have created essentially an inclusion policy where they think about how they want needs to be met, and some will concretize it and put it into more of what the bylaws or the mission statement is of the synagogue, but one doesn't necessarily have to do that. It can be in a more informal thing of saying, this is how we're going to handle, seeing to it that we are being more inclusive of people with disabilities. Some synagogues have created buddy systems for both people with disabilities and their families, where they will either have a neurotypical family be there to kind of help guide the new family that's moved into the neighborhood that has the child with disabilities, and it's paired up so that they see to it that there's a child mentor who makes sure that a child feels comfortable in either Shabbat groups or in the Sunday school, and there's kind of a pairing buddy system. Sometimes it's done that you have a buddy system where it is two families that each have children with disability, and it's a partnering of such so that parents can have mutual support, neurotypical siblings can have support with other neurotypical siblings of children of a child with a disability, and then there is the children with a disability, and it's kind of a pairing that goes on. Some do it in a more formal way, some do it in a less formal way, but that too can be a very opening, welcoming feeling for some families who are coming into a synagogue setting in a relatively cold way, and it really can be of benefit to them, to the family with disability that wants to be included. Also, there are some synagogues have created support groups in larger synagogues where parents who have children with disabilities get together on an informal basis once a month to really just have coffee, to talk, to see. Sometimes they will have, I've known of a synagogue that created a kind of a Sunday morning coffee clutch where the kids would be in Sunday school, and it was an inclusive Sunday school setting, and the parents would have coffee and bagels and be able to talk. And in one synagogue I know they had another person within the congregation who was a psychologist. She was a facilitator, and it really got a chance for many of the parents who really felt that it was a bit of a struggle with their child with disabilities, that to be in an environment where they were able to really discuss and talk about it, and for it to be within their spiritual home, it was a very helpful, comforting, and empowering sort of setting. So support groups are also another avenue to create a more inclusive environment for inclusive synagogue settings. I have here now on the screen an inclusive synagogue infrastructure setup for you to look at. This isn't written in stone. This is kind of a sort of helpful way of thinking about creating the infrastructure within a synagogue. Oftentimes, people just think in terms of kids with disabilities in synagogues, and therefore everything gets talked about in terms of the youth director or the head of the Hebrew school or the head of the Sunday school, and there's no thought given really to the aging population that is getting progressively more disabilities, whether it be hearing impairments or physical mobility issues, and also just those people within the congregation who fall in between the elderly and the young, and who have disabilities. And oftentimes there's a way of them all falling through the cracks. And by creating an infrastructure that really views part of their mission as creating an environment that is completely inclusive of people with disabilities, one has to think in terms of the entire structure of the synagogue and how it works. And that is where, again, the inclusion committee, which I mentioned earlier, is so, so important, because essentially those people who are part of the inclusion committee should be serving on every other committee that is involved in the synagogue, whether it be a one-off committee of just, say, the planners of the Purim Carnival, or it's an ongoing, the ritual committee, or the program committee, or the communications committee or membership committee, those ongoing, larger programming sorts of committees. Somebody needs to be there also who is thinking about being the segment of the community that either the person has a disability or a member of their family has a disability. And by having a structure where you have an inclusion committee and you have those members on every other committee, and including somebody on the board who is part of that inclusion committee, so that they can always keep that hat of being inclusive on their heads during the board meetings, just so that they can make sure that this segment of the population is not being forgotten. This slide in particular gives you a sense of how it should be. And I always say that I would hope that one day this won't be necessary, that at some point within the infrastructure of the synagogue, things become so de rigueur of being an inclusive place that no longer will it have to be that there's a separate inclusion committee. But until that time, I think it's really worth investigating and worth thinking about and approaching one's house of worship to really see whether they would be open to thinking about structuring the way things happen in order to become truly inclusive of people with disabilities. As we talk about programming, as we talk about programming, sorry. There seems to be a lag when I, when we're talking about inclusion programming, there are many ways, there are many things that have to become part of the infrastructure. I mentioned some before, and I think it's worth really digging a little deeper into it. Shabbat morning groups is often a big thing. If one does not offer some form of inclusionary aspect to Shabbat morning groups, it is like throwing a family away with both hands, and out of the religious womb of a synagogue setting. Shabbat morning groups need to and have to be ready to take on children with disabilities. If that means that you have to hire Shabbat group leaders that have some sort of background in special education, then maybe that's exactly what it means. It has to be, and if not, and if you only use high schoolers, then I think that there has to be training that goes on before the school year begins, where it's discussed how are we going to be inclusive of children with disabilities. Chances are, within your community, within your synagogue, you know of certain children who do have disabilities. It goes back to talking to those families, what we discussed before, asking the parents, what do you think your child's needs are? What does your child enjoy doing? How does your child learn in general? And trying to tailor make and seeing what kind of a group setting you can have that will work, that will be beneficial to this child, and where this family and the parents will feel that they can leave their children, be able to pray, and that their child will feel safe and comfortable and have a good religious experience in the synagogue or house of worship setting. Oftentimes, and nowadays it's becoming more and more commonplace that Shabbat morning groups do offer a sensory calming room, that one of the classrooms that's being used has a few beanbag chairs, has some sensory friendly toys, has low lighting instead of the overhead fluorescent lights, that they just put in some low lighting so that there's a sense of calm, and that this room, it goes back again to having signage up, that it is labeled as a sensory calming room. It's really important. if people don't know about it, they won't hear about it. If they don't see it, they won't know it's there. And things need to be labeled. They need to be advertised in your weekly newsletter, in the family newsletter, that this is available. It's another way of telling people who have family members and children with disabilities that they're welcome in your synagogue setting. And so the sensory calming room costs a few $100s to put together. It's really nothing. You can talk to any special education educator and or that's in your community, or an OT, or even a PT, and just really better an OT who is really familiar with various low-key sensory toys, have some books, some books on a bookshelf. Just have a nice quiet room. You can make the rule whether you're going to have a person stationed in that room, whether you want to have a parent attend in that room, but it should be known that it's a sensory calming room. It is not to be used as another playroom for the neurotypical children. It is really a place where when things get overwhelmed, where a child gets overstimulated because they were either in the services or they were in groups that were too stimulating, that they have a place to calm down. The adaptive holiday programming, I mentioned about having carnival time earlier. Almost with every holiday, there's a way to try, and if you have matzah baking, Passover time, that can be, if you're going to have it be in a very large group. Again, there can be a preset time where you have for smaller groups. It's just going that extra mile and being extra sensitive towards those families can make a big difference. And then, of course, bar and bat mitzvah programming. That has to be a person available in the community, in the synagogue, who is readily happy to work with children who have varying degrees of disabilities that might prevent them from doing what is the normative practice within your synagogue for a bar or bat mitzvah. And that person can be found either by seeking out a professional who is a member of your community, who might be willing to volunteer time, or it will be an investment of finding the right type of person. But there are so many resources that one can find online. And above all, you can find so much of these things you can look at respectability.org. There's a whole Jewish inclusion section, and there are practical guides that we have in there that have been written that involve and have so many different ideas and programming thoughts for so many of these ideas. I see I just want to say that synagogues, again, I did this wrong. Synagogues can be a portal to better living for people with disabilities, and I think that certainly goes for all religious institutions, but it is a way to give people with disabilities another avenue for feeling included in the spiritual the spiritual side of society. And I think that many of these tips can be found through usage of all that is out there and available to us, and especially looking at respectability.org is a wonderful way to find lots of things that are available to the Jewish community and to religious communities at large. And I'm happy to take any questions if there are any questions. And I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Operator, can you let people know how they can ask a question, please?
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have dialed in and would like to ask a question, please press 7# on your phone now, and you will be placed in the queue in the order received. Again, that is 7# on your phone. Listen for your name to be announced and ask your question when prompted. You can also send your questions via the Q&A chat located on the lower left of the presentation. Type your message and press Ask to send it.
While we're waiting for people to submit a question either via the online system or via phone, Shelley, you presented a lot of really great information on how people can do better. I was wondering, is there anyone that's really doing it well? Do you have a good example to share?
Of a particular synagogue that's doing well?
Either a synagogue or an aspect that someone's doing well. Even I mean, I'm personally on the co-chair of the inclusion committee of my synagogue, and I know that it's impossible to do everything well at the beginning. But sometimes some people will do one aspect really well. Is there something, just a good news that you would like to share of someone doing something well?
Well, it's interesting. There's a synagogue that comes to mind that really did what I thought was really an exceptional thing of programming. It was a synagogue that felt like they were close, like they had it in mind and they were doing lots of things, but yet they felt somehow that they were missing the mark. And they created a Shabbaton that they said was an inclusive Shabbaton that was really to teach congregant to congregant what people were going through, and what was not working for them and what was working for them in their synagogue. And it was fascinating because what they did was they had a panel for Friday night speakers, and it was all people in the community. There was a little person, there was a person who had autism. There was a person who was deaf. They had really a wide range, and the people spoke about their experiences in the synagogue. And it was, things came out that people had never ever thought about. One talked about how actually all three persons on the panel complained about Kiddush. And the Kiddush room, and how overwhelming it was for them to walk into this room that was just filled with all these people, and it was so loud, and it was so, and people, pushing kind of around the table where the food was, and it was just a really not good feeling for any of them. And it was interesting that they realized that they had like a partitioned off part of where the Kiddush room was, and where there was slight attached room, and they decided that they were going to open up part of that and have part of the Kiddush also be able to trickle in there, and that they would label it that it was just for a quieter, calmer Kiddush. And it was just their way of that was ultimately what came out of that synagogue's need for lowering kind of the decimal of what was going on during their Kiddush time. And they actually had the entire Shabbaton. They then had a speaker who also had a disability, and she spoke from the pulpit, and she talked about just the need and the feeling and the desire to feel included in the Jewish community, and how sometimes from an institutional standpoint, from a synagogue standpoint, that she felt very left out. And it was really, you saw through in the Mincha Marav time at the afternoon and evening service at the synagogue, they had a speaker who came in and spoke about employment and how the Jewish community really would need to do more and make more of an effort for inclusion within a working way. And the synagogues really realized that they should be having, and I know that they have since employed a person with a disability in their office. And it was really a way, it was just a really, I thought, a wonderful self-created programming that really raised the level of awareness in the synagogue and really intensified the synagogue's desire to be an inclusive place.
Thank you. Do we have any questions via phone?
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. I'm going to hand the call over to Respectability President Jennifer Lazza-Mizrahi for a moment.
I just wanted to say, Shelley, how fabulous this webinar was and how much I really appreciated not only you walking people through in a very intentional, thoughtful way, but the fact that you've been a great role model for all of us at Respectability. And I wanted to ask you, because I think you've really been instrumental in terms of children being able to be included in synagogue, Hebrew school programs and other children's programming, if you would share sort of a favorite story of including a child so that they could be involved in faith education.
Let me think. There was a child who really was so, he was on the spectrum, and he really felt that there was just no place for him, you know, anywhere essentially. And it was very nice. I remember this one rabbi was really intent on seeing to it that this child really had a place. And what was more, the first time the father walked into the synagogue on a Friday night, and he had brought his son. The rabbi, at the end of the service, the father said that, you know, some people looked at him very annoyed as the child was acting out, and the rabbi had gone up to him and he said to him afterwards how happy he was that he came to his synagogue, and he said, and if anybody says anything to you about your son, please let me know, because I'll be happy to ask them to leave. And then from that point, the rabbi then asked the father where the child was in school, found out that the child was in a public school, and then started the conversation of what can we do to have him be a part of our Hebrew Sunday school structure. And they ended up accommodating him by having him be in part of the more social aspect of the Sunday school program, and then they had a person on staff who worked more one-on-one and in an individual way with this child. And I have to say that was a really amazing rabbi, and it really started at the top, and that was a situation where they had to differentiate their learning environment. They decided to put the more social aspect of when the kids were doing a play sort of thing that could be a little bit more where the child could be moving around more, that they included the child in, and then they did for the learning part where he was not able to really sit and focus, that part they adapted and had a more one-on-one sort of setting for the child.
That's a wonderful example of people who put a lot of intentionality, a lot of love, and a lot of thought into the work. Do we have any other calls at this time?
We did have one, but they disconnected.
Oh, okay. All right.
So if the person is still on, or has the question, you are more than welcome to contact us afterwards, and we will make sure that Shelley gets the question so you can receive your answer.
Right.
Shelley, did you have any closing comments?
No, just thank you very much. And I just always say that, like, wherever there's a will, there's a way. And if a religious institution or house of worship desires to be inclusive, you can be inclusive. There are all sorts of levels to it. And the thing is to just keep trying and keep building upon that desire. And it can happen. And I wish everyone who was listening a lot of luck, and let's all work towards creating a more inclusive society.
Thank you very much for that message. Thank you, everyone who has joined us for this webinar. To find out more information, you can find us online at www.respectability.org. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.